Hello and welcome to everyone that's joining us tonight. My name is Lisa Sawsville and we are hosting Farley Brown, who's a faculty member at Sterling College and the past executive director of Vermont Coverts. So some of you know Farley in her role here at Vermont Coverts. And she's going to be speaking on the reflections on the historical land use and then the wildlife habitat responses to it here in Vermont. And we're really excited to have her here. Vermont Coverts is a statewide nonprofit that works with landowners to educate them about sound forest management and wildlife stewardship. If you're not already signed up for our e-news, please do so online at our website. I'll put the website in the chat box. We ask that you keep your mics muted and type any questions into the chat box, and we will be happy to answer those at the end of the presentation. I'll read them to Farley. If we need a little clarification, we may ask you to unmute, but otherwise we want to keep the background noise to a minimum. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Farley and take it away.
Great. Thank you, Lisa. This is really always so much fun to come here to Coverts and to actually do some presentations. I was so inspired by the work that I did with Coverts in terms of looking at the landscape for wildlife. And so I just feel really honored to be coming back now and sharing my experiences and my knowledge with Coverts and hopefully with cooperators as well. I know. So tonight I am going to talk about landscape history and the wildlife response. I will be taking us for a walk way back before Europeans came to settle this landscape. And so we will be spending a long time or some time talking about long ago. I come to this issue this topic because I have always been so fascinated with land use history. I have walked through my woods for 30 some odd years and I come across, barbed wire or some pots and pans or old sugaring equipment. And I often wondered, what did it look like beforehand? What were people doing on the land? And I do teach a land use history and planning class. And I have my students go through the deeds property deeds, to look back throughout history as to how land exchanged hands. And it's really fun because when you get back into about the turn of the century, which is kind of where this picture that's up of Irisburg was, you start seeing how in the deeds, the land, the grantee got the land, but quite often it also mentions the black mare and the sugaring buckets and the hay in the barn. So that type of information, again, for me is really fascinating. And it also makes me wonder, how does wildlife respond? I'm gonna there we go. So recognizing that it's not just us who change the landscape, there are other wildlife, especially the beaver, these keystone species, that are really critical in changing the landscape. While some of the changes that we have made have definitely had issues or created impacts to wildlife habitat, the beavers also drastically change the landscape and really create biodiversity in regards to the providing or the creation of habitat for many other species. So beavers that go way back in time, there's a wonderful book by Alice Atwater called Water, A Natural History. And she has data in the book that goes back to just looking at the, trying to better understand beavers, prehistoric beavers, when they were like 10 feet long and big and so forth. So anyway, beavers have always been a real interesting species in my mind because they tell a story, not unlike the story I'm reading in my woods. So I do want to use some different images to help take us through time. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Harvard Forest dioramas. They're down at the Fisher Museum in I think it's Petersham, Massachusetts. And these are wonderful dioramas, those like shadow boxes many of us used to make when we were in school. And so there's a series of these dioramas that show the land use or the landscape change over time, specifically using Massachusetts as a site. So I'm going to use this as a way for us to get a better understanding of New England and what New England looked like a long time ago. So again, pre-colonization, we were looking at or the landscape, the pre-settlement forest was pretty much what we see somewhat today. It was a northern hardwood forest, so beech, birch, maple, intermixed with softwood in there. Charlie Cogbill has done some fantastic research on those prehistoric forests and going through all these town historical land use deeds back to when the surveyors would use a certain tree species to mark a corner as a monument to the property boundary. And so from that information, Charlie has been able to definitely has been able to clarify or to help us understand the pre-settlement forest. So before Europeans came to this landscape, specifically up here in New England, it was the Abenaki people were found throughout Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont. And the Abenaki people, also known as the people of the dawn or whitening sky at daybreak, have played a critical role in the use of this land over time. I understand that Chief Don Stevens was with Vermont Land Trust and talking about sugaring some time ago, and I hope people were able to watch his presentation, because the Abenaki were on the landscape. They as a people actually traveled around following food sources, but they also had settlements. They had settlements where they would build longhouses that had enough room for 40 people or so. They would have a fenced-in area, and then their agriculture plots would be on the outside. So again, kind of a unique indigenous culture of using agriculture. The three sisters, beans, squash, corn, were the produce that they were actually raising, the products. So the Abenaki, again, lived as communities in these settlements, but they also did hunt and fish the landscape. And it was really important for them to be following the wildlife, specifically following the deer into different parts of the woods. Their preferred food for their hunt would be moose, just because would give a lot more meat. The Abenaki now, we're very fortunate in the state of Vermont that we have given recognition to the Abenaki as a tribe, as people who were here pre-settlement. And there are several clans throughout Vermont, and the Abenaki clan up here in the Northeast Kingdom is the Nulhegan Abenaki clan. And Sterling College is working very closely with Chief Don Stevens, who's now on our Board of Trustees, but we're working closely to better understand the Abenaki ways, and historically and currently. Beavers, back to beavers here. When the Europeans came to this part of the country, they were here in search of beavers. This is like the 1600s to the 1700s. The beaver was a driving force. The Hudson Bay Company was really an important role in terms of the settlement of this land. I started to say beavers were a really driving force in the exploration of New England as a whole, and working all the way up into Hudson Bay with Canada. And at that time, beavers were so prevalent. They actually would say that what is now Vermont used to have 300 dams per acre in, I think I have that, per acre in across the Vermont landscape. So with the removal through mostly the trapping for hats, that the removal of the beaver off the landscape had tremendous impact, not just to that species, but to many other species that rely on the beaver ecosystems that they are creating. In the early subsistence farm in Massachusetts, so the 1700s, this was a time when we were getting onto the landscape and settling the land, and again, clearing off the land and actually trying to forge or to make a living, have survival, basically in the New England area. And as we were beginning to settle and we were hunting and trapping for food, and we were cutting a lot of timber along the way just to keep our to build our buildings and also for fuel. It's in the early 1800s, so basically 100 years later, that the landscape throughout New England was cleared. And it was cleared mostly because of the merino sheep industry. And that's where, again, this particular livestock that were voracious grazers actually were going across the landscape and clearing the land. Once again, we were feeding a market that both was in the States, the textile mills, but also there was wool being actually sent overseas as well. So I quite often show this slide to my students in my watershed class. And I say, think about not only the impacts to wildlife, again, the habitat is taken off the landscape, the beavers are no longer there, but think about with this open landscape, how the water would be shedding, how it would be moving across the landscape, and where that all that sediment might be heading into waterways. So when we think about in the Stowe area and around Mount Mansfield, we think about Mount Mansfield was at one point 2/3 of the way up denuded. It was totally harvested for timber. And again, the rivers, they just ran chocolate, they say. It's full of sediment. So a lot of the soils, the fragile stream banks we have now are partly made up of sediment that was created both from running off the landscape, but also for the mills too. During that time of having an open landscape, having the livestock as our major source of food, or excuse me, income, there was a real push to get predators off the land. So I think that, was it in, oh my goodness, 1881 when the last catamount was shot in Barnet. And so there's like the whole idea of taking those species off the land that might be actually in conflict with livestock. So catamounts were taken off, coyotes were hunted, bobcat were definitely taken off the landscape. This is actually from my neighbor's backyard. Some bobcats who are definitely back on the landscape. And again, a lot of those species that were considered as predators were then removed. So think about, we have beavers are gone, the landscape is open, the habitat drastically changed, the predators are taken off the landscape. And so at that point in the middle 1800s, we're looking at a population or a makeup of wildlife that's definitely very different than what we would like to see now, which is in terms of biodiversity. In the 1850s, the farms were abandoned and people moved out west. People, actually, the Civil War came along and people left, and quite a few didn't return to farm these rocky hillsides, especially up in Vermont. And again, the opening up of the West and the railroad took a lot of people off this landscape, and people were moving out west. In this diorama, again, it's the exact same as the very first one that we saw. You can see how the landscape is changing once that intensive farming, specifically sheep farming, is gone, that the land is now reverting back to what it's known in terms of the pre-settlement forests make up the northern hardwood forest as well as softwood. What's really interesting here, what we see is that what's coming into these abandoned pastures are a lot of white pine, a lot of pine coming in, and we see that even today. So as the land was abandoned, the farms were abandoned, that even age stand of white pines were coming in, and that created a whole new market for timber. Up here again in the Northeast Kingdom, we did not have the sheep industry as as it existed down in southern Vermont or south of Montpelier area. and also throughout the rest of New England. But we realized our economy was built upon timber up here in the Northeast Kingdom. So once the timber was removed off, then the land went back into that northern hardwood forest. Excuse me. And now we could see that there was more of a habitat returning for a variety of different species. And we started seeing the reintroduction of wildlife actually prior to this hardwood forest coming in. Deer, which were extirpated, were taken off the landscape. They were reintroduced in 1878. I think it was just 17 deer were brought in from New York State, and the population boomed. Beaver were brought in back onto the landscape in 1921. And again, with the creation or the beavers coming back on, we've seen their population explode. And now, of course, we see a lot more of conflicts with our infrastructure, but they also provided that habitat necessary for a variety of other species. In 1959, the Canada geese or goose was reintroduced. Now think about what we have in our backyards today, between beaver and Canada geese. It's amazing to think that we actually had to reintroduce them. Also during that time, 1959, fishers were brought in. Fishers were brought in to help to manage the porcupine population. And Dave Clarkson, who is a longtime Coverts cooperator and council member, Dave Clarkson told us the story of buying his marriage license by bringing in the ears of porcupines. There was a bounty on porcupines, and if you could bring in the ears, you would actually get a certain amount of money from your town clerk. And he was able to get his marriage license that way. Wild turkey were brought in 1969, and then martins, which we'll talk about, the American martin was brought in 1989. So just again, looking at a reflection here, this is actually hasn't been updated information, but it gives a sense that how in the turn or back in the 1800s, we really were looking at a landscape that was 85% open or 80% open and another 20% forested. And we've seen that switch, that flip around now in 2021. We still have the 80%, 90% forested and a lot less open land. The tricky thing is about when we talk about the forested landscape now, we also have a tremendous amount of other land uses going on in those forests that are a real, still puts wildlife at conflict with us. I'm going to just do a really quick flip through of some pictures that we're going to come up here to Craftsbury, just real quickly to get a little bit more of a sense of that landscape change, that landscape, how it was and how it is today. So I'd always start off with this particular family farm down in southern Vermont, just to show, again, I think a great view of this denuded landscape, the hillsides being lacking the forest. And that is in part because of, or a big part of it is because of the sheep industry. Whereas up here, as I mentioned, up in the Northeast Kingdom, timber was our major source of our economy. Timber, many towns have plenty of mills that were taking the lumber or the wood off the forest and creating a product. But also a lot of the logs were just floated downstream and put on a boat up to, in Newport, up to, if they weren't milled on site, the raw logs would go up to Montreal, to Canada. This is one of the 28 mills that we had in Craftsbury, just down the road from me. Beautiful sawmill, built on bullseye granite, which is a really unique geological formation, unique to Craftsbury and one other place in the world. And so this landscape, we definitely now is a lot more grown in. So this retaining wall on the, folks can see this, on this sawmill, we can still see the remnants or the leftover pieces of that retaining wall, but we see a stream now that's got a lot of coverage and cooler waters, and really basically the Black River is running free at this point, no longer dammed up. We had a tremendous amount of open land in Craftsbury. We did have some farming, but not necessarily sheep. And I was just out there today, just looking at on that hillside, looking at our incredible infestation of buckthorn, but realized just looking at the land, we're still farming it, putting animals out there, but it's so grown in. The Black River, as we move up into the to Lake Memphremagog, we definitely have an open landscape here in Albany, Vermont, and again with the hillsides cut over, and that's what it looks like today. Irisburg was a major where a lot of the logs were floated to, as well as in Coventry, and that's what it looks like today. The Black River definitely has a lot more coverage. The fish population is a lot more diverse than it was at one time. Fish and Wildlife has done a lot of work in restocking these rivers, and my wildlife class goes out with Judd Kratzer every year to use electrofishing techniques to better understand the population dynamics of the rivers. Just an example of the log jams that were happening in South Bay just before getting into Newport, and what it looks like today. So this landscape change is really important to understand, because if we have to, or hopefully have learned a lot of lessons by having an open landscape. In these large floods that we saw in 1927, as well as the 38 storm, a lot of these towns were drastically impacted, not unlike with Irene, in terms of flooding, a lot of the damage that was done. It is now that we have hopefully a better understanding of maintaining a intact forest that would help to alleviate some of these particular stormwater problems. So I just want to go back to this reintroduction date, and we're going to look really quickly at some of these species. So as I said, the deer were brought in, 17 brought in from New York. The population, as many of us know, is quite big at this point. I was asking some hunters around the area what they've seen in terms of the changes in the deer herd or any other species over time. And one fellow was saying, well, he doesn't see many fawns, but there are a lot of deer. So there are a lot more on the landscape. Beavers again brought in, and within 2 decades, the population soared to over 8,000 beavers statewide. Also looking at the Canada goose, as I mentioned, the wild turkey, and then the marten I'll get into in a second. These first 3, I actually forgot to put Fisher on the list too, because Fishers came in 59. But these top 4, I always wonder, like, why were they reintroduced? Well, they're game species, and so it's a lot of the money that has come from the Ducks Unlimited, Trout Unlimited, Rough Grouse Society. A lot of those funds were used to help bring in to reintroduce different species, as well as the looking at hunting licenses. The martens was definitely a big, the American marten reintroduction was a big project that Kim Royer, who has worked with Coverts for many, many years, was heading up, where they brought in 115 from Maine and New York into Vermont. And there was a real concern for about 10 years that the populations really weren't settling here. But then they started finding more and more individuals across the landscape. One marten was had a collar on, was actually found all the way over into Maine. So deer, as I mentioned, the interesting thing I received from folks over at Fish and Wildlife was some deer harvest information. And they have this from 1970, this image, which I thought was really interesting. It's like, why was it that so much of the deer harvesting was happening over on the eastern side of the state? Well, again, it's a reflection of the land use and specifically around agriculture as well. So we definitely do have deer populations, especially associated with agricultural lands, but definitely having a little bit more diversity in terms of forested landscape as well as a open landscape. And here we are in 2019, and it's almost like the deer harvest has shifted a little bit. I'm actually going to put these two side by side. And what I think is interesting here, it's somewhat of a reflection of, first off, the change in the landscape from an open landscape to possibly a forested landscape. But there's also a change happening in terms of um, the this age of the forest. So even if we didn't have as much open agricultural lands in the Northeast as in the Addison County area, we're still seeing a difference in terms of the number of deer harvested in 2019. More of an even age stand potentially. Over in especially the Northeast Kingdom, potentially. So the reintroduction of beavers, as I mentioned, I keep coming back to beavers because I just find them so fascinating, was really critical in terms of a variety of other species coming in. And the other thing about beavers, again, is providing that habitat for so many other species. So we see that amphibian populations that are definitely have been growing, and the Vermont Amphibian Atlas, Reptile Amphibian Atlas, when you go back to Mark Labar, I think it was, who was when I was in grad school, was over at UVM. They just began in the 80s to start documenting the reptiles and amphibians. But we know that the wetlands and the lakes and ponds and river systems are definitely important for different species, including moose and other forms of larger fauna that really require, both that difference in terms of habitat, food source, and so forth. This is a moose that we got caught on our game camera, the wildlife conservation class, way up towards the Lowell Mountains in a upland wetland area. So tons of sign again around the actual wetland. As I mentioned, the turkeys coming in now, they are all over the place, and they are here up here in the Northeast Kingdom. They're here to stay. They stay through the winter as well. And I have students who are out turkey hunting real recently, and they're just always pleased to see how many turkey they can find on the landscape. As I mentioned, the fishers that were brought in, their population has definitely exploded. To some of us who raise poultry, definitely we've had some conflicts with fisher, but they definitely play a role in terms as a predator. This again is caught on our game camera for the class. This is closer over towards Wolcott Pond and the wildlife management area in Wolcott. And again, I mentioned the American Marten and the fact that the American Marten project was really a big project here in the Northeast, and with again Kim at the helm of it. And the population is definitely returning and has returned. I don't know much more about the actual breeding population that's here throughout the state, but they do exist across the landscape here. So these are great stories of successful stories of reintroduction that has gone on. But we continue to have issues with other species that are really finding a major struggle in terms of habitat. I was talking to an older fellow in town who's 90 years old, who's been birding since he was, oh boy, as a teenager. And one species he said that he no longer sees, or it doesn't see as much, is the Baltimore Oriole. That he would see Baltimore Orioles quite a bit up around here in the Northeast Kingdom. And though I have students who are really into photography, were able to capture these birds in actually this comes from Connecticut, where one student's from. But the Baltimore Oriole, it's that the habitat changes not just here in northern Vermont, but throughout the flyway. The habitat loss, the climate change that's happening as well has been severely impacting the Baltimore Oriole population. This is from the Audubon bird count, Christmas bird count, and I'm sorry I didn't cite the source, but I focused solely in Vermont in their data set just to get a better understanding of the decline of the Baltimore Oriole. And again, it's over the years that they're really seeing that there was a spike, and then the species has been dropping. Again, it's not just what's happening here in Vermont or the Northeast, but it is a reflection of habitat change throughout the flyway, throughout the interior or the wintering and breeding grounds. What we know through Coverts is that there really needs to be a diversity of land management happening, specifically forest management. You know, we recognize, many people in Coverts recognize that we need to create that diversity in the forest, because an even-aged forest is not going to be able to provide habitat for a wide range of species. So recognizing that certain bird species really require a variety of different types of habitat. We've seen, even with folks who are not necessarily in hay, their land's not in hay production anymore. We do have landowners who will intentionally go in every couple of years to mow and to help maintain that type of habitat. Say for around here, it's the bobolink that we're looking for, and having that open field. The great thing that's happening, or another great program that's happening outside of Coverts, but through Audubon Vermont, is the Forest for the Birds, the project that Steve Hagenbu has been working on in terms of really educating foresters and forest land owners, specifically in managing their sugar bush for birds, and recognizing that there are birds, are birds that that need that vertical structure. And so that we can really be intentional about where we're opening up the landscape, and how somebody who's managing their sugar bush is looking in terms of managing for sugar maple, and again, providing that real diversity in structure. So the fact that our forests have been changing, and we have in some areas uneven or an even age forest, that's been one of the issues for wildlife that's dependent upon that vertical diversity, as well as that diverse horizontal structure. So really critical to note. The other big issue that we're seeing around that's impacting wildlife on the landscape now is related to invasive species and health and disease that's been going on. So this is the same moose that my students caught on a game camera up in the Lowell Mountains. And this particular view of this bull, definitely doesn't look healthy at all. I know that Fish and Wildlife has been really looking at the amount of impact that winter ticks, the ticks have on the moose, in part because, again, of climate change. The fact that these ticks that winter over are not going through a winter kill, but that they are able to, in warm weather, they're able to survive on the moose. They're not, so that's one of those major impacts of climate change impacting our now resident wildlife, specifically moose. And of course, the other issue, or the other one is, is parcelization. This is a really interesting model that Tom McAvoy from Vermont Coverts many years ago, and myself, we put this together for a talk that we did, oh my goodness, back in the 90s on Across the Fence with Tony Adams, for folks who remember Across the Fence. And we were talking about fragmentation, but also parcelization. And the fact that fragmentation definitely is a great impact to the actual movement of wildlife, be it a highway, be it industrial buildings, whatever. It's something that's fragmenting the movement or the habitat and thus the movement. But parcelization is a whole nother issue, well, connected to fragmentation, but it's when we start developing the landscape for our housing, which we need. If we don't take wildlife into consideration, there can be some real drastic impacts. So by putting houses, sprawling houses across the landscape, as opposed to clustering houses, we introduce different species, us, onto the landscape, our dogs, our cats, and as many of us know, that dogs and cats, especially cats, can have major impacts to wildlife and bird population specifically. And so parcelization is a really key issue to address. And so one of the steps forward, I'm going to just talk about the good things that are happening. One of the steps forward on addressing parcelization and fragmentation is the passage of Act 171. And that Jens Helke has done a great job in getting the information out to communities about, now through our planning process, how we have to also look through or identify in our town plan those areas that are large interior forests, blocks, as well as connectivity blocks, those areas that actually where wildlife can pass through from one habitat to another. So one of the best efforts that we're doing here to combat the threats to biodiversity is to really look at through the regulatory process and Act 171. And I really encourage folks, if you haven't had Jens come to your planning commission or your conservation commission, definitely bring him in, as he definitely has been really provides a lot of great information about how a town can actually inventory and then plan for the protection of the large interior forests, as well as those connectivity blocks. I think, yeah, when we talk about the large contiguous forests, we're definitely seeing benefits both for the scarlet tanager, which I just had up. We're seeing benefits for black bears as well. We're seeing benefits for many different species who are need those interior forests for survival. And it's by individuals like Coverts cooperators and other private landowners that we can really help to ensure that that habitat is there, habitat is being protected. It's also recognizing those species that are not just vulnerable to our land use, but that are really vulnerable to climate change. I think quite often about the birds in regards to our neotropical songbirds in terms of climate change and the impacts that that they are finding in terms of their habitat destruction, but also the change in the climate of their breeding ranges. Somebody recently said to me that the insects are being impacted either positive, like by weather, by having some of these invasive species that are coming in, but also those species that are native are definitely a food source, a really important food source for some of those birds. And so it's really important to have to take in consideration the climate changes that are going on. So again, land use in terms of looking at our development of the landscape and understanding also some of the more vulnerable species that are also being impacted by climate change. So I really applaud Vermont Coverts and the landowners who are doing a lot of work to help to protect or to protect the wildlife and provide that habitat. The idea of working across boundaries, thinking on that landscape level, looking at connectivity is critical, as many of us know, in terms of providing that biodiversity and through having a healthy forest, a healthy landscape for a real diverse wildlife population. So I leave it at that. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be more than glad to try to answer.
Thanks, Farley. That was great. So if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type that into the chat box, and I'll be happy to relay that to Farley. Farley, I want to ask a little bit, the maps that I assume it's Nick put together on the deer hunting was fascinating to me to see, where it's kind of shifted and, did he do any correlation, or have you done any correlation with also like where population is settled in comparison to 70 to 2021?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Nick and I were going back and forth on email a couple of weeks ago and trying to figure out like what is it about that increase in the deer harvest in some parts of the state. And he was thinking mostly from a land use perspective. The population in terms of the hunting population, my understanding is that has dropped a little bit, but the take, we're really looking at the shift in terms of the harvest that's there. So, but I don't know. And I would think that the 2019 map, where we saw a lot more of, or a greater take in the eastern part of the state, there'd be an issue with land use and development going on there. So good question. Yeah.
I've been thinking about so much of this lately, because, it's spring. And so I was out looking at invasives. I'm out pulling honeysuckle and garlic mustard. And, I was recently down in Connecticut, and garlic mustard is everywhere. And so it was a little disconcerting. And then I got up here and I was like, oh my gosh, we got to do something. And it's overwhelming. These changes that we've brought about and wanting to fix, it's like I said, it's overwhelming.
It is, right. And just walking in the woods with the new forester that the college is working with, it is overwhelming. I had a whole team of faculty members out there with our new forester, and we put up our hands like we don't know where to start. Between the buckthorn and the euonymus is phenomenal in our area in Craftsbury, and we're really the gateway to the kingdom. And Jared Nunnery had once said to me that really it's the responsibility of the college as well as other landowners in the Craftsbury Greensboro area for us to try to control those invasives, because otherwise it's just going to keep on spreading north. We're not finding it as much as you see down south here.
Yeah, it's interesting, and with the COVID shift, we had more people moving up here. We've always been the playground. I was talking to someone about it the other day. There used to be all these camps like on Lake Dunmore, on Echo Lake, and and now there are houses there. So there's still an influence, but people are getting their 30 acres and building their houses. And how is this shift going to continue to affect our wildlife species that we're trying to manage for diversity and VCD? So, it's these questions we keep need to ask them, and we all need to think of our own land ethic and how we can be working with that in mind as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good point.
Someone suggesting that a student do new updated versions of the Harvard Forest specifically for Vermont.
Oh, right.
A good student project, they said. Yeah, a good student project.
Right. Those dioramas are amazing. I've never seen them actually down at the museum, but there's a wonderful book that's available, the website at the Harvard Forest. I mean, anyone can access those dioramas, and I just showed a few of this larger installation that they have. But what's that?
So I've seen them.
You've seen them
in person.
How
big they're amazing. They are huge. So they're probably like 8 feet in width, length, and then they go deep back into, and you walk around a room, and they're all along the outside. It's a horseshoe, and then there's a conference room in the middle, and it's fun. It's just like walking through time. Yeah. It's so fun. I recommend it to anybody. We should totally do a Coverts field trip down there.
That would be great. That would be great.
Would be a lot of fun.
Dovetail with the Massachusetts Coverts program.
Yeah. Oh, I may have to talk to Yeah, blanking on his name at the moment.
Yeah.
Paul Catanzaro.
There you go. Right. But no, the dioramas, my understanding from reading about them is that they're actually just made out of wire and clay and painting. I mean, they're really a piece of art. I mean, they're phenomenal. So yes, it would be great to have a student do dioramas of Craftsbury, but also to see a 2020 or 2021 diorama too.
Yeah. They have some great pictures at the what's the museum in over near Dartmouth? The the
Montshire.
Thank you. I slept there with the Girl Scouts. But yes, the Montshire Museum, they have some wonderful historic pictures upstairs that show the landscape over time. That's another place that for those of you that are on the call, if you want to go see some more, that's a great resource for you. Another great resource, Farley said, she walks her woods and she finds barbed wire. She's looking at the stone walls. There's a great book called Reading the Forested Landscape that some of you may be interested in looking at. That also looks at, how fire might have moved through and which side the burn is going to be on. And it's a fascinating book to read. That's another one that might be out there.
Yeah. And the other great resource too is Landscape Change. It's a database put together by UVM. And it's where I get a lot of those old pictures where they took a picture and then they got the picture and then they took a picture at the same location. And you can access it by UVM Landscape Change. And they went around, actually it was when Jens Helke was a grad student, they went around one summer to all the town's historical societies and scanned in, definitely with lots of pictures. And I've done that in Craftsbury, just scanning in Craftsbury pictures into a database so they're accessible.
That's really cool. I didn't know about that database. I'm gonna have to go check it out.
Yeah, UVM Landscape Change.
Cool. Yeah. Very cool. That's a good thing to mention. Yeah, Alicia wrote to everybody that we've done webinars on many of the species that Farley mentioned, and they're on our YouTube channel. So we've done one on martins, we've done one on turkey, we've done one on deer, we've done one on beaver throughout this, and all the recordings are posted up on our YouTube channel. So if anybody wants to see specific programs about them, you can jump there and see those, which is exciting.
Great.
So it doesn't look like we really have any questions. People have said thank you for great information and photos. And I would like to thank you for joining us tonight and sharing. I always love getting to spend some time with you. So this has been fun. Zoom has allowed that to happen more this year than over the past 10 years.
Right, exactly. It's great to be able to see you as well and to actually see names that I recognize and from cooperators as well too. So thank you for having me here. This has really been fun.
Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. We hope you have a great evening. We have some other programs coming up that you can see on our website under the calendar feature, and we feature our programs as well as other organizations' programs that you might find of interest. And many are still Zooming, although there are a few in-person events that are coming up. And so watch for those and have a great night.